Beyerdynamic has continued production of its older DT series headphones for decades. The DT770, 880, and 990 have a strong following, especially among professionals. This year, the 600-ohm variant of the DT880 got a lot of hype. Someone on YouTube promoted using it with a very powerful stereo amplifier, the Emotiva Bass X A100. This amplifier is about $230 and has an internal mod a user can implement to nearly double the power output from the headphone section. Unmodified, the A100 provides 300 milliwatts at 600 ohms. Modified, it provides 600 milliwatts at 600 ohms. I made a video explaining why this amplifier was both unnecessary and rather dangerous to your gear and your hearing. My hypothesis was that the 880 does not require a ridiculous amount of power, but instead high output impedance. In that lengthy video, I explained the tests I did using several amplifiers, the research I had gathered, and recalled the conversations I had with Beyerdynamic, all of which confirmed that the 600-ohm variant requires high output impedance. Indeed, my test revealed that the 880 performed at peak with an amplifier which has 100 ohm output impedance and around 100 milliwatts of power at 600 ohms. The four amplifiers that tended to work best were the Beyerdynamic A2 and A20, K and IHA6, and Sound Devices HX3. Since conducting these tests, I found that the K HA1A Mark II also works well with the 880, but clearly provides far too much power for me to recommend the HA1A as an 880 amplifier. But all of these amplifiers are very expensive and clearly well outside a reasonable budget. This is partly why I think that the Emotiva amp is so attractive to people. The Emotiva is cheaper than the cheapest amp with high output impedance that I tested. But I have a new alternative, one which I have been testing for over a month. It is dirt cheap, and it works. Before I get into the alternative amplifier, we need to spend a very brief amount of time talking about why you may want to consider it. People want quick answers without putting in the effort to figure out why something works. There are two issues that owners of the 600-ohm variant usually talk about. First, getting the headphones loud enough, and second, getting tight, precise bass. You can get the 880 loud enough with a lot of amplifiers, including the Shit Magni, but the real limiter is the bass. On the majority of amps I tested, the 880's bass was loose and muddy, but when combined with an amp with high output impedance, the bass was tight, hard-hitting, and with good sub-bass and mid-bass separation. So the idea with a cheap alternative amplifier is to make sure we get both issues solved. That is, the cheap amp needs to get the 880 loud, and it needs to provide bass that is not muddy or bloated. I researched for months to find a cheap alternative for the 880, and I finally found it. This amp is made by Douk Audio and sold through Knob Sound, and is found on eBay and AliExpress. It's about $60, depending on where you get it. This product is actually an amp DAC. It has a micro USB input for your computer, Mac, or PC. It also has a line-in jack. The DAC is a Philips TDA1305, a DAC I have never seen mentioned anywhere else in audiophile circles. This amp's output impedance is 120 ohms. The power output is 200 milliwatts at 300 ohms. I could not find any information about the power output at 600 ohms, and when I contacted the sellers online, I never got a response. Here's the short answer. Yes, this $60 device does in fact drive the 600 ohm variant of the DT880. And here's my long answer. The Douk amp gets the 880 super loud. The volume knob turns from about 7 o'clock all the way around to about 5 o'clock. Depending on the loudness of your recording, I seriously doubt you'd ever need to go louder than about 12 o'clock. Even on some poorly recorded MP3 tracks where the volume was reduced, I did not need to go past 1 o'clock. And around 2 o'clock, the 880 became far too loud for me on any song I tested. There is no doubt whatsoever that the Douk amplifier will provide an abundance of volume. Now, to the second issue of bass response. We know that with typical amplifiers, the 880 will have a muddier bass response with greater amount of audible distortion than with amps that have higher output impedance. In order to test this, I compared between the Douk amplifier and the next cheapest alternative, the Beyerdynamic A20. I had the A20 connected to my Soundcause LAQXD1 DAC. I played numerous tracks, including Mountains by Hans Zimmer, Bim Bam Smash from the Bourne Supremacy soundtrack, and several hip-hop songs such as Uproar, New Patek, and Post Malone. Switching back and forth repeatedly, I had the following conclusions. To match volumes, I maxed out the volume output on the Soundcause. I used the Douk amp as my reference volume and set that to around 1 o'clock. The A20's volume knob turns from 7 o'clock to about 5 o'clock, which is virtually the same amount of movement as with the Douk amp. I was able to match volume on the A20 around 2 o'clock, which was about 1 o'clock on the Douk amp. The bass response was close between the two amplifiers, but I think that the A20 had an overall cleaner presentation with slightly greater separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. Both amps recreated sub-bass with about neutral emphasis. When I went back and forth, it appeared that the Douk amp was a little bit muddier and, depending on the sub-bass frequency, sometimes caused a hint of distortion. This distortion was audible only for a very specific range in the sub-bass, and I'd guess it was close to about 20 to 30 Hz. Indeed, as I listened to all of my test tracks, I was cognizant that there was tighter presentation from one of the two amps, but that difference was not night and day. When it comes right down to it, the A20 provided better control over the sub-bass than the Douk audio amp. I never heard any form of distortion from the A20. Mid-bass impact was very close between these two products, but I think that the A20 was marginally tighter and more impactful. This, of course, could be attributed to improper volume matching. I connected the Douk to my Soundcause using an RCA to 3.5mm line-in cable. Using the Soundcause's neutral DAC, I heard no difference in bass reproduction from what I heard through the Douk's internal DAC. In other words, I do not think that the bass performance alters with another DAC connected to the Douk amp. But what about the mids and treble? Well, first we have to talk about the DAC in the Douk amp. I think that the Philips DAC in the Douk amp is a bit on the analytical side. I would not say anything sounds harsh or peaky, but when compared to the neutral Soundcause, the Douk does have a slight emphasis on treble frequencies. The mids and treble sound different between the A20 and the Douk amp. I believe female sibilance is very close between the A20 and the Douk, but the Douk accentuates that detail marginally. Again, this could be attributed to improper volume matching, but I don't really think so. Male vocalists sound marginally smoother on the A20, and the Douk amp has slightly elevated sibilance, but nothing that becomes harsh. The decay of instruments is indistinguishable between the A20 and the Douk amps. Timbre is also seemingly identical. Melding between instruments seems to be similar, though maybe a bit more melding occurs on the Douk amp, and I think you would be splitting hairs if you compared it. There was no audible distortion or harshness in the mids. Bass does meld slightly with the mids, but vocals always remained clear and distinct. Indeed, I could not find any track where vocals seemed recessed or muddy. Treble is very similar between these amps, and frankly, I really could not tell a difference. I listened to Scherzo for X-Wings over and over again, and I could not find that either of these amps recreated the treble energy noticeably different from the other. When I listened to Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the saxophone seemed to have the same energy between both amplifiers and appeared to be smooth. Separation of instruments was indistinguishable to me. Overall, I think that the A20 has slightly tighter control over bass than the Douk amp. Moreover, I believe that the A20 might be marginally smoother in the mids. The Douk amplifier has USB connection that works with your Mac, PC, and iOS and Android devices. Indeed, I connected to my iPhone 12 through the requisite Lightning USB adapter. I connected to my LG V30 through a USB-C to USB-A adapter. This clearly underscores the Douk amplifier's usability. Not every DAC connects so easily to every device, but this one does. There's no need to download drivers. Everything is plug and play. Clearly, this video is shorter than my typical reviews. I've already done the legwork about high output impedance and power requirements for the 600 ohm variant of the DT880. If you want to know more about that, you should go watch the video on the subject. Here, we just have to find out if the Douk amplifier is a viable alternative to the more expensive high output impedance amps. And while we're at it, we should determine if anyone should bother with the Douk amp in light of the Schiit Magni and Emotiva options. I think you get better performance from the A20. The A20 provides tighter bass response, slightly more obvious sub-bass and mid-bass clarity, and slightly smoother mids, but the differences were not night and day. The Douk amplifier exhibits some distortion and bass melding, but only when the music has emphasized sub-bass. Turn to any folk, acoustic, pop, rock, or orchestral track, and that marginal distortion is irrelevant since the sub-bass is not emphasized in the original recordings. The performance versus the Magni is an interesting comparison. I think that the Magni is marginally smoother in mids and treble than the Douk, but I also find that the bass is slightly tighter on the Douk amp. You could attribute this to improper volume matching or listener error if you want, but the fact that the Douk does not sound worse in the bass response is of some significance, I think. This brings us to the issue of the Emotiva amp. Look, I've said this over and over again. The Emotiva is a dangerous option. Beyerdynamic clearly warns against exceeding the rated power requirement of the 880. I have never heard the Emotiva, and despite some people's protests that I do so, I simply will not. I am not in the habit of spending money to make other people feel better. I have no need for the Emotiva and would rather concentrate on products that show better value. To that end, I think the Douk amplifier does provide value, specifically with pairing on the 600 ohm DT880. You get a powerful amplifier and a decent DAC, small form factor, and hassle-free operation. For $60, there is nothing to complain about. I'm sure some audiophiles will show disdain for another Chinese product, but at some point you have to realize that is where value happens to be, at least in this instance. Now, you may also ask me if I'd choose the Douk audio over the Beyerdynamic A2, A20, KN IHA6, or the Sound Devices HX3. And the answer is no, of course not. I like those amplifiers quite a lot and use them regularly. But I already have those amps. Looking at this question objectively, I would have to say that I would choose the Douk amp over the HX3 since the Douk amp is far less expensive and less hassle to boot. I might even be inclined to concede that the Beyerdynamic amplifiers are unnecessarily expensive, which of course they are, and are not real value, in which case the Douk amp would be a wiser choice. And that's just the point. The Douk amp is the wiser choice. In the month I've been using it, I've tried to find faults in build and sound. I did not want to recommend something that would fall apart a few weeks after you get it, nor did I want to recommend something that had subpar performance overall. But I'm happy to say that the Douk amp exceeded my expectations, though they were low to begin with. The fact that the Douk amp can even begin to compete with something like the A20, an amp designed to work with Beyerdynamic's own headphones, is quite the achievement. Ultimately, you will not get the best performance from your DT880 through the Douk amp, but you'll get fairly close. Moreover, you get easy connection to any PC and mobile device. If the Douk amp was about $100 or $150, I would not recommend it since you could probably do just fine with something like the Schiit Magni. But at $60, it's a bargain. Yes, I recommend this Douk amp DAC. If you have a 600 ohm DT880 or are thinking of buying one, the Douk amp is an affordable method of driving those headphones.